Hello, everyone. I am Julia Zahreddin. I am the Equity and Advocacy Advisor for Cohere, and I am really happy to welcome you to this workshop about funding for refugee-led organizations. We are so grateful to all the practitioners who continue to show up to this workshop series, and to those who are just joining us for the first time today. Welcome. And given that we're talking about funding, I'm also extending our special thanks to IKEA Foundation, who's funding this series and enabling us to share these valuable lessons with the sector. So I'm going to share the series housekeeping rules before we start. Please use the coming minutes to change your name and add the name of your organization. So you can go in participants, you hover your name, you click on more or on the three dots and you rename. We have a decent amount of time for Q&A and interactions with speakers, so please keep yourself muted and use the chat to introduce yourself, give insights, and ask for assistance. If you have technology problems, you can find Sianwa Atemi in your chat box, and he will help you. The Q&A will be recorded, so you can send your questions to our moderator, Diana, directly if you want to be anonymous. Otherwise, you can put them in the chat or raise your hand, and you can also keep your questions for the breakout rooms where you'll be able to chat directly with the speakers. So this workshop is the fourth of Core's series on organizational pathways towards meaningful participation and refugee leadership, where we gather guidance from experts and where we hold participatory discussions to unpack the internal changes that are necessary to enact refugee leadership in the refugee response system. We held 3 first sessions on equity learning journey, recruitment and hiring of people for displacement, equitable partnerships that are available on our YouTube channel. You will find the link in the chat box. And after the session that we're having today, we'll have one more left that is scheduled on March about supporting localized refugee-led advocacy. All the pathways that we're presenting in this series will be gathered in a document that you'll be able to use as a guide to navigate internal and systemic and structural changes within your organizations. But today we're talking about funding for refugee-led organizations. This is a conversation that practitioners in the sector start to get used to having, but today we're aiming to take it from a different angle. We'll talk about what's qualitative and equitable funding. We'll talk about concrete mechanisms enabling mindset shifts, about reflections to understand whether we are gatekeeping or not, and about mechanisms to enable community-led accountability, among many other things. All of this closely tied to our series philosophy. Let's start the work inside our institutions. The session will start with a first panel presentation about the current funding landscape for RLOs and the dominant funding practices, explaining why this dominant model doesn't work and what access to high quality and equitable funding looks like. This will be followed by a second panel presentation detailing the 5 pathways that we compiled with our speakers to operationalize change towards high quality and equitable funding. And the second hour will be highly interactive. You'll be able to chat with speakers during the last panel presentation, but also during the Q&A and during the breakout rooms. So let's dive in. Be ready to take notes and to take these insights with you to shake things back in your organizations. Diana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julia. Hi, everybody. I'm Diana Essex-Lettieri, and I am, it's an honor and a pleasure to continue to support Cohere as a moderator for this series. We have 5 incredible speakers to introduce you to, so I'm going to dive right in so that we can begin our discussion. First, I'd like to introduce you to Hane Alrustm. Hane is the Director of Programs at the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative, which is the 3rd largest RLO intermediary funder in the world today. As a person of forced displacement, Hane believes that solutions come from within displaced communities, and this is what motivated him to join RLI. Before joining RLI, Hane co-founded the Shift Social Innovation Hub in the north of Lebanon and founded the SEDA Troupe for Playback Theater, which provides a safe platform for communities to express their narratives, memories, fears, and aspirations alive on stage. SEDA works with hundreds of children, women, and men. Hani is also a board member of the International Playback Theater Network and has a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's in theater studies. Thank you so much for being here, Hani. I would like to introduce you to Najeeba Wazefadost. Najeeba is one of the founding members of the Global Refugee-led Network, the Global Independent Refugee Women Leaders, and the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, which has a funding mechanism for RLOs called the Refugee Leadership Alliance. Najeeba has been actively involved in the development of refugee-led networks at the regional and global level, enabling those with lived experience of displacement to convene and propose solutions for more effective and sustainable refugee policies. In the past, Najeeba has worked for the UNHCR as a gender audit consultant and is the founder of the Afghan Women Business Network in Asia Pacific. At 10 years old, Najeeba fled Afghanistan with her family. She sought asylum in Australia by sea in September 2000 and spent several months in a mandatory immigration detention before being recognized as a refugee. Among other accolades, and there are many, Najeeba has a bachelor's of medical science. I'd like to introduce you to Maya Hasan. Maya is an award-winning entrepreneur and community builder. Maya is the founder and technical advisor at Fearless Project, an online education startup for workplace diversity, equity, and inclusion. Among other projects, Maya has spearheaded the Shifting Power Accelerator, which offers INGOs the opportunity to investigate their positionality in the system and work toward more equitable and liberatory ways of working. Maya has over 20 years of nonprofit humanitarian and development experience and has worked with an extensive client base, including BBC Media Action, Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, International Rescue Committee, IOM, Oxfam, Save the Children, UNHCR, and beyond. Honestly, I had to break this list down. There was just an incredible list of clients. Maya is based in Puerto Rico, is a proud multicultural, non-binary woman, trauma survivor, and person with invisible disabilities. The daughter of Pakistan and Indian Muslim immigrants to the United States, Maya has lived most of her adult life in the global South and speaks 10 languages. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Barri Shorey. Barri, welcome, oversees the Refugee Initiative and Disaster Relief and Recovery Program at the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation, Barri spent 16 years at the International Rescue Committee, overseeing and implementing programs supporting refugees and displaced populations through the arc of a crisis, providing cash assistance for basic needs during an emergency, and improving access to employment, entrepreneurship, and financial services in more stable contexts. During her time at IRC, Shorey lived and worked in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East with a specific focus on curriculum development and private sector partnerships. Barri received a master's degree in international education from George Washington University and a bachelor's degree in philosophy and religion from Colgate University. Welcome, Barri. And a special welcome, just to share a little bit more about Julia, our very own Julia Zardine, who is going to be providing some introductory information to us. So a proper introduction to Julia today. Julia is the equity and advocacy consultant working as an advisor for Cohere. Before joining Cohere, she held positions as advocacy manager at Urban Refugees, supporting refugee-led advocacy in East Africa, and critically examining the impact of INGOs' localization efforts. Recently, Julia authored the report addressing 5 barriers to implementing meaningful refugee participation in the refugee response. Julia has worked as an advocacy officer at Oxfam on tax justice, world inequality, and the regulation of extractive industries. So I know that those were long introductions, but they were worth it so that we know how incredible this set of panelists is. And let's get into the discussion, starting actually with our very own Julia. Julia, in order to understand the discussion today, when we were prepping for this, we felt it was really important that we provide access to data, as much data as we can get our hands on around the funding picture for RLOs. I know that you've been working on compiling this information and this data on the subject. So what can you tell us about the funding picture? What is reaching RLOs, and what's the current funding landscape?
Thanks, Diana. So I'll be trying to summarize key insights from the Humanitarian Policy Group and the Overseas Development Institute 2023 reports, shedding light on the 2022 RLO funding landscape. So to begin, available data shows that any increase of funding to RLOs gained during the COVID-19 pandemic has been lost. ODI managed to locate 26.4 million USD reaching RLOs, primarily across Ukraine, Colombia, Lebanon, and Jordan. There is undoubtedly more funding, but the majority isn't adequately tracked, so it is difficult to draw a comprehensive picture of the global flow of funding to RLOs today. What's sure is that RLOs remain chronically underfunded. While available data show that they received 26.4 million USD in 2022, the humanitarian system allocated over 6.4 billion USD to the 10 UN coordinated refugee response plans in 2022 for the comparison. The median grant size for RLOs is at around 26,000 USD, a bit more than 26,000 USD, and it is 10 times lower than grants given to local and national NGOs and 20 times lower than grants given to INGOs. And it's not surprising that RLOs express frustration in receiving small, project-sized, restricted grants that hinder their organizational development and fail to cover overhead costs. Philanthropies play a crucial role and provided 8.9 million USD to RLOs in 2022. 83% of funding identified was provided through an intermediary, with an average duration of 22 months for philanthropic funding and 14 months for intermediary provided funding. The report emphasized that intermediaries, which include INGOs, UN agencies, pool funds, RLO, and RLO networks, are not a homogeneous group, and that some are working better than others, are cutting to their strategic intent to fund RLOs, if it's a core objective or a relationship based on convenience, according to their governance and the transparency of the structure, and to the inclusiveness of their decision-making processes and the involvement of RLOs in all stages of project design. Overall, there's a growing consensus that the role of intermediaries needs to evolve and that donors should prioritize those that are led and staffed by refugees and/or those that are demonstrating a commitment to co-designing initiatives and participatory selection processes. Finally, the report underlines that most funding arrangements remain performative and tokenistic, rooted in biased, neo-colonial assumptions, top-down approaches, and a persistent disconnect between RLOs and donors. And overall, this perpetuates the current unfair and inefficient funding system that demands urgent attention and reform that we're going to talk about now. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Really appreciate that summary of the very rich ODI report and other data available to us. Turning to Hane. Hane, we know that the Resourcing Refugee Leadership Initiative is one of the largest intermediary funding groups for RLOs in the world. So congratulations on your many successes and thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
We're really curious if you can help us make sense of the data that Julia has provided. Is this funding enough? What can you tell us about the quality of that funding? And how do you think those current funding practices, the dominant ways of working, are impacting RLOs?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question, and I'm happy to be here. It's a big question, and I mean, the first answer is no, it's not enough, and it was never enough, even with the increase. We can see, like, comparing the numbers, like 6.4 billion versus 26 million is really very small number. I think I would here ask a question about, like, what is impactful funding, and when we ask if it is enough, if it is impactful enough, from which angle do we see it? impactful, good enough funding should be profoundly it should profoundly have the community of refugee leaders in the heart of the practice, in the heart of the conversation about the needs of their community. They must take part of the decision making and being able to influence the politics behind any funding stream. At RLI, we have, for example, participatory grant making. Our coalition members who are refugee-led organizations, and also now our grantees are taking big part, and they are taking the biggest part of selecting where the money will go to, and also deciding on how the resources will be distributed to other RLOs as well. Also, our processes are always subjected to change based on the change in the context and based on the feedback of the community and the need of the community. Maybe I can summarize some of our values which we think helps a lot in making quality funding. Most important is large amounts of funding, which we see it's never happening. Giving multi-year funding, flexible funding, covering core cost, having participatory approach, and also having a needs-based funding, not a kind of political oriented funding is important. And I think also thinking about strengthening the capacity of refugee-led organization is important to be accompanied with any funding. It's never about money, it's never about capacity strengthening separately. Let me know if the time is running.
You have time.
Okay, great. I just want to say also, due to many factors I mentioned above, I think most of the donors cannot give quality funding because first they are not first-hand experienced in forced displacement. They don't know exactly how does it feel and what does it mean. They come from a place of privilege, and I think the practices and the international funding mechanisms come from colonial mindset, and it has a lot of power dynamic implicated in it. And we hear this always when we ask why things are not changing, that we have internal barriers, and we can never really identify what these internal barriers and why it is not changing. If we give an example, if I want to go more deeper in it, I believe that politics is implicated a lot in the funding and how much the funding is going to where and to which country. And we cannot separate that. Each donor is in a way or another influenced by the government they operate from, their politics and their interests, their political agenda. If we take a very simple example, what is happening in Gaza and Palestine today, it is very evident that a lot of the funding get cut because of the political agenda of the international global north community. Despite that, we can see every day that people are dying, people are suffering, and what is happening is beyond, a human capability of understanding it. Still, we can see that politics rule in the end, and funding can stop even if there are millions of people suffering in a place like Gaza. I think also a question is about the how we
Just
are.
one,
Yeah,
can I invite you to pause? We'll let Najeeba weigh in on this question as well, and then we'll come back to the to some of the how.
yeah, yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, Najeeba, I would love to bring you into this conversation as well. I know that APNOR and the Refugee Leadership Alliance are also making some pretty big strides in getting funding to RLOs. So congratulations on this work as well. And in the chronically hard to fund Asia Pacific, not just for RLOs, but for the whole of refugee response. So what would you add to Hani's response in contextualizing Julia's data? What would you say about, is the funding enough? I think we know the answer to this question, but what would you add to that? And what can you tell us about the quality of that funding and then the impact on the people and the work?
Sure. Thank you very much, Diana. It's always quite difficult to go after Hani, but I'll do my best. And also considering that I'm actually joining from Australia, which is almost 1 a.m. So I'll do my best to make this as attractive as possible. I do want to emphasize and agree that the current funding scenario for refugee-led organization is unfortunately still relatively a very small piece of the pie. I would say it's like working with a fraction of the available resources, as Hani mentioned. So now, when we look at the dominant models that are in play, I can, I can clearly say that, and I think Hani was also mentioning as an example within the RRLI, is that, it seems to be more about maintaining the status quo rather than addressing the inequalities within our sector. So the mechanisms in place often end up favoring the larger, more established groups, and we've seen this within the Refugee Leadership Alliance as well, which can be a hurdle for grassroots organizations, for grassroots initiatives, smaller refugee-led organizations in particular. So most often when we talk about quantity, it's just not enough to cover the diverse needs of RLOs. We are dealing with a limited budget for tackling, a multitude of challenges in refugee communities. So again, if we are to refer to the quality of funding as well, then we often come across with criteria that are quite restrictive. While we were actually trying to set up the Refugee Leadership Alliance here in Australia, we looked at the different grants mechanisms that were actually available by different donors. And we did see, that quite restrictive process. We interviewed so many grassroots RLOs within the Asia region to look at what was the hurdles and the barriers. And we realized that for many of them, it was challenging to leverage, their own unique insights and experiences within the complicated of funding mechanisms and processes. What we also, I think what's also quite important to mention is that we also saw a noticeable absence of refugee voices in the institutional environment. And what I mean by that is that it directly ties back to the whole representation issue. We're still stuck in the top-down processes that lack accountability, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about this in the next questions. It often, focuses on refugee leadership that often falls short of true localization. Most of the bureaucratic barriers that we're dealing with are real hurdles, and we're still not entirely clear on the why for some groups. And I'm talking more about governments, UN agencies, and you name it. The agenda setting then needs more work to do. So now, everyone knows that we are aiming for an impact. As Hani mentioned, what do we mean by improving impact of fund? Everyone talks about it, but here is the twist. We often forget that funding for refugee-led organizations should go hand in hand with decentralization or relocation of power. For us, that's been the main focus. There's a bit of confusion and a lack of learning, especially amongst donors, intermediaries, and implementing partners. And the how of this shift is still a very fuzzy part, which again, I'm sure we're going to talk more about it. So as we venture into this journey, into this change journey and the mechanisms that enable bottom-up accountability, intermediaries do often face a challenge. There's a lack of critical analysis, mindset, and tools to figure out whether they're being a barrier or a facilitator. knowing, when to stay under which role and when to exit. These are crucial decisions that still require some clarity when we talk about impact funding. And something that I would end up with, which Hane also referred to, is goes back to funding, inflexibility, issues with size and project costs, accessibility challenges, and limited relationship and access to spaces. These are all the nuts and bolts that are creating barriers. We've seen it again, in our own example here in the Asia region, as we were trying to establish the Refugee Leadership Alliance, and I'm sure this was the case also with RRLI. So again, gatekeeping, especially, the role of intermediaries and INGOs plays a part when we talk about impact funding again. It's about ensuring that you're not in the way and understanding your role, versus being a competitor. That's huge, whether you're in Asia or whether you're in other regions around the world. So there's a bit of risk aversion at play too. So when it comes to, when it comes to impact, the lack of each of these elements has tangible consequences. It maintains the current colonial system, placing the burden on refugee-led organizations. And in some cases, doing more harm than good, to be honest. And we've seen it. We've seen a lot of examples. So it's not just a theory. It's also about, the real-world impact on the ground. So we've got our work cut out for us in untangling, these knots and fostering a more effective, inclusive, and impactful approach. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Najeeba. That was so rich. And between you and Hane, I feel like we have a set of issues to address. And our second panel, I hope, is set up to think through some of the specifics on addressing the issues that you're laying out. But before we dive into addressing the issues, the big how, we're hoping that the two of you can paint for us a picture of what an alternative looks like. What does it look like to have a high impact funding mechanism in place? So maybe starting with you, Najeeba, please. In your experience, what does high impact funding look like? And what is standing in the way of that being our collective reality? And I know you touched on some of this, so anything to add?
Sure. So again, it's another great question. So let's talk about access to high, impact funding for refugee-led organization. I would say, picture this. We need to shake up the way funding works right now. We are talking about creating opportunities that let refugee-led organizations grab hold of more significant and, more importantly, flexible financial support, all tailored to their unique needs and insights. So high impact funding should be really about, I would say, innovation, sustainability, and solutions that come straight from the communities. Most often we do talk about this, but it doesn't happen in practice. If we are to make a real and lasting difference, then that the high impact funding should really be about innovation, sustainability, and solutions when it comes straight from the communities. So we want funding for RLOs to be the norm, but not the exception. So this involves building strong relationship, as I mentioned, between RLOs and the donors. It's not just about the quantity of funding, but the quality, and that's where multi-year co-funding becomes crucial. And again, I think we touched base on it a little bit in the earlier question. So now here's the hitch. There are roadblocks in the way of the perfect scenario. So first off, there's this bias that seems to always favor the big players, leaving our smaller refugee-led organizations, grassroots initiatives in a bit of funding struggle. As I mentioned, the dominant model often doesn't prioritize a bottom-up approach, which is the most essential part for working with refugee-led organizations. There needs to be, or there is a need for a shift in the mindset that values community leadership and seeks coalition and donor accountability. And at least, in my experience working, at global level and regional level, and also here at local level, but more importantly, throughout, the convening of the Refugee Leadership Alliance and RLO to RLO funding model here in Asia, we tend to see that not often we do value community leadership. Not often, there is a prioritize, around seeking coalition and donor accountability. So on top of that, there are these strict criteria tied to funding sources that put a lead on how refugee-led organizations can use their funds based on what they see on the ground. And then I would say there's another actually snag as well. Not everyone fully gets the challenges faced by refugees and the importance of supporting local leadership. It has taken us on many occasions that we have come across a new donor, a new intermediary, a new INGO, a new stakeholder, where we actually had to spend years just to teach and educate and create an awareness around what exactly the challenges means on the ground for refugee-led organizations or for refugee communities. So this lack of awareness and understanding amongst not only donors, as I said, even divided stakeholders is like a dam, basically like a dam, blocking the flow of high impact funding. So what we need to do is to spread the word. And again, not only get donors on the same page, but also all the other intermediaries, and other stakeholders who are also playing, as a way to resource refugee-led organizations or refugee work, and encourage, more importantly, collaboration between them and these organizations. So in a nutshell, what I would say is that we are looking at a need for a major mindset shift in how we approach funding. We're talking, again, inclusivity. We're talking about flexibility, and again, really grasping the unique challenges that refugee-led organizations are actually facing. If we can break down biases and build strong partnership between donors and grassroots initiatives, we'll be on the path to a funding landscape that truly makes a meaningful and lasting impact. And breaking down, the barriers might mean involving creating, again, I'm going to emphasize on this again. It might mean, creating a bottom-up accountability mechanisms. It might mean encouraging equitable partnership between RLOs and NGOs. It might mean about fostering trust or understanding and adaptability, in a donor-broker relationship. So all of this would be required as a way not only to, strive for a funding landscape that not only supports, but it also truly empowers refugee-led organizations, allowing them to lead initiatives that makes a lasting impact on the communities that they serve. And I'll leave it there. Thanks, Diane.
Thank you, Najeeba, so much. And Hani, to close out this first panel, same question. What would you add to what Najeeba has said here about painting this picture of a more equitable, more successful, effective funding landscape for RLOs? And what do you think is standing in the way?
Yeah, I don't know what to add after Najeeba, actually. I think like one important thing I would question is the will of INGOs and donors to change. Like, I think like this is like a major question for us. Like, do they want to change really? Like, because we have been talking for a long time about this, but there is very little kind of change happening. And I think this is related to what Najeeba was telling about in terms of the mindset shift that we need to do and the learning. Like, there's a lot of things like the donors and the INGOs and policymakers should unlearn and do differently. A question I ask always to myself, would at some point UNHCR, for example, decide to give its power in Africa and just transition and leave Africa and give leading the response to refugee-led organizations? I'm not sure it would, because there is a lot of political, economic questions that are, attached to this kind of work they are doing there. And I think this is all like standing in the way of changing. Refugees, for example, are always asked to do the work. However, I think we should not do the work ourselves only. The other side of the equation should also do the work. Refugees most of the time are looked at as numbers, as people of concern. We should never be considered like this. We are decision makers. This is, in Syria we say we are the parents of this child. No one can take care of the child. We should do it. So yeah, I think also like there's this question of how do we understand the experience of people? I think a lot of the practices are not trauma informed. They never consider our experiences. They never consider the way we lived the war or the displacement itself. And a question is like, again, how much people of power are willing to give the power to refugees, how much they want to change, and how much they are really ready maybe to lose their place, their location, their kind of position in this sector.
Thank you, Hani. And thank you, Najeeba, both of you, for providing us such a clear list of issues that we need to address as a sector, as a community that cares about solving the complexities of displacement. So we're going to move directly into the second panel here, and I want to invite everybody, please start thinking about your questions. Please put them in the chat box, and you can also chat them to me directly. Julia and I had the opportunity to work with each of the 4 speakers, and we compiled a list of pathways or the concrete steps that donors and intermediaries can take to help promote equitable high-impact funding. Julia, do you want to walk us through those 5 pathways? And then I will invite our speakers to help us unpack and make sense of each.
Yeah. So first up, the first pathway we crafted, the first pathway of the list we crafted is working on mindset and positionality. This is followed by second pathway, embracing relational, accessible, flexible, and sustainable funding. Next, we've got pathway 3, establishing bottom-up accountability mechanisms. Then pathway 4, encouraging donors and INGOs to increase community representation in their teams. And finally, pathway 5, advocating for donors to foster equitable partnerships between RLOs and their chosen local allies. So let's see how we can make these pathways work for us.
Great. Well, with that, we're going to embark on this second panel. And would really like to give, again, a formal welcome to Maya, who's going to kick us off on understanding pathway 1 around working on mindset and positionality. Maya, during prep, you really helped us to understand that this first pathway in enabling funding to reach RLOs is, once again, we've heard so much about this in this series. There's a whole session on mindset and learning, the first session that we can put a link to in the chat, around addressing mindset. And in your words during prep, you called this liberatory thinking within the donor and intermediary institutions. And we know that you run a series called the Shifting Power Accelerator, where you deeply support institutions to embrace liberatory mindsets. And so we are so excited to hear from you. What does it look like for donors and intermediaries to embrace the kind of mindset that would result in the kind of high impact funding practices that Hani and Najeeba were making reference to?
Thanks, Diana. Yeah, Hani and Najeeba spoke to it quite well, and so I'm just going to continue to, just support what they were saying as well. So you're absolutely right that mindset is the very first and crucial step on the pathway to change. But it's important to question, what do we mean by mindset and why is this important? So I'm going to first put it in the context of organizational mindsets. So it's a very obvious task when you start an organization to think about your mission, your vision for the world, and the values that you hold, and the goals and approaches that you have to help you get there. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen vision statements that have said they're working towards a world where every refugee has a voice, or every woman has a choice, or every community is able to make decisions for their own futures. But let's be honest, is this really the world that we are building as intermediaries? Or are we building a world on our own terms with some input sometimes? So, please stay with me for a moment. I'm going to ask a few questions. Isn't it that most INGO and donors are listening to refugees only when they have time or when it is convenient for them? Isn't it that most INGOs and donors are only offering women choices from a small, predetermined menu of options to choose from? Isn't it that most INGOs and donors are offering community leaders rapid consultations and not full or even co-decision-making power? So you tell me, am I wrong that this is the mindset of a typical INGO or donor? Feel free to mention it in the chat. So it's not at all liberatory in their thinking, but boxed in, as Hane said, as by the constraints of a system that is a holdover from colonialism. And sadly, we're not truly serving refugees, displaced persons, and other communities, but instead they are serving us by informing us, by giving us input, by giving us feedback, by being consulted. But so rarely are they considered true equal partners, and with the dignity to be able to make the right decisions for themselves, their communities, and their own futures. So I don't want to paint a terribly bleak or dark picture for the sector or demonize INGOs or donors, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that INGOs and donors have good intentions and have the capacity to change. But it's also important to recognize the problem before settling out to tackle it. And that's why this mindset work is so important. The work of interrogating our values and our principles, because it impacts the way we work and the future that we're building. And it's important to be honest about the challenges that we're facing in the building of that future that recognizes the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, that recognizes the full agency of refugee communities, displaced communities, and their leaders to determine their own futures. But this is really important. The elephant in the room frequently is that power is at the center of it all. And power is not an easy thing to talk about ever, but it's especially difficult, if not impossible, when the inequalities are so great. So when INGOs and donors are truly interested in living up to their vision statements, their values, and their commitments, they are doing the work of analyzing power. And it's not a step that can be skipped. Power dynamics, again, as the other speakers mentioned, Hane and Najeeba, power dynamics need to be understood, identified, and challenged for equal partnerships to truly exist. And there are many NGOs and donors, such as some of the organizations featured on or funding this panel, like IKEA Foundation, really APNOR, Hilton Foundation, and so many others. So there is hope, and we should learn from them. And we should ask ourselves the hard questions. Are we shifting power to refugee-led organizations, or are we powering over them? Is your funding supporting the long-term sustainability of these RLOs, or is your funding short-sighted and creating dependency? So there are so many questions to be asked and many resources to help you begin or continue the work. So those are just a few, hopefully, to get started.
Thank you, Maya. I feel like one of the things we keep hearing in this series is that meaningful participation and shifting power go hand in hand, and you can't have one without the other. I really appreciate how you laid out that connection. We know that, to follow on the conversation, we know that the mindset shift isn't just for donors and intermediaries, but it's also required by anybody who may be in a position to gatekeep, meaning that through their actions, they're intentionally or unintentionally blocking funding from getting to RLOs. I think this is what Najeeba was making reference to, this importance of asking ourselves, are we standing in the way? So we wanted to address this issue of gatekeeping head on. We hear a lot of times, INGOs or national NGOs that are not run by people of forced displacement expressing that they're not gatekeeping. And we know that because we're making an impact and we have measurements of success. But we're really curious, can you help us to understand, how would one know if they were gatekeeping? What would that look like? What kind of self-reflection would need to be done to understand that that's what you were doing?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I appreciate you also sharing your definition of gatekeeping. I did another search online in dictionary and did the same. So this is what I came up with. Gatekeeping is the activity of trying to control who gets access to particular resources, power, or opportunities, and who does not. So gatekeeping is about who gets access and who doesn't. So let's be honest, at a micro level, we are all gatekeepers because the vast majority of us have some type of power. Some of us have it more than others, but we all have it. As an example, in our personal lives, again, Hane mentioned this about power over our children, parents' power over their children, or you might think of influence over your spouse, or some kind of influence in our community, in our different types of relationships. So most of us have the ability to make decisions on a daily basis that impact the lives of others. And this is especially true in our work lives, on our teams, in our organizations, and in our funding and partner relationships. So the question really shouldn't be if we are gatekeepers or if we're engaging in gatekeeping behavior. It should be how are we gatekeeping? When are we gatekeeping? And we might think this is more relevant to say donors and then INGOs, but national NGOs need to be asking themselves the same questions. And I'll put this in the context of some principles shared by the Movement for Trust-Based Philanthropy, which I suggest everyone here check out if you aren't familiar with it already. Are we giving short-term project-based funding, which is effectively gatekeeping? Or are we giving multi-year unrestricted funding, which embraces this trust-based philanthropy philosophy, trust-based funding, high-impact funding? Are we relying on RLOs to spend time and money on educating us? Or are we doing our own homework on the issues that face RLOs so that we can better support them? Are we asking RLOs for piles of paperwork to qualify for funding? Or are we simplifying and streamlining these processes as much as possible? Are we being transparent and responsive to RLOs as they need us to be? Are we soliciting and acting on feedback? Are we offering support beyond just the check, beyond the money, the organizational support that many of these organizations so desperately want and need and are asking for? So the key thing really is assuming that you have some form of power, big or small, that you are gatekeeping. It's just, how can you stop? How can you give it up? How can you step aside when needed?
Maya, thank you so much for the concrete guidance. And also I see that some of the materials you supplied us, Daniel has put into the chat box. Anybody can check out those resources, and thank you for compiling them, Maya. And Barri, we wanted to bring you into the conversation as a follow-on to this first pathway around mindset. Thank you so much for being here. Maya just helped illuminate some of the journey toward enabling the kind of institutional mindset that would result in high impact funding for RLOs. And we heard in the last session from one of your grantees, Lu Blanc Prieto, the executive director of Refugee-led, how incredible Hilton has been in direct funding. If you haven't watched it, you should go watch it. It was a really glowing endorsement of your ways of working. And this is a fun fact, a very fun fact, a number to celebrate, that you share that Hilton gives 50% of its forced displacement portfolio directly to RLOs. We are so curious about how Hilton got there on this. What advice do you have? Can you just tell us about Hilton?
I always love doing these panels. And we're new to each other, but I love it, but it also means I have to follow these incredible, wonderful human beings, which is embarrassing for me. But a true treasure they all are. And just to recognize Hane's point about, I hold a position of power in that I make decisions where resources go. to support outcomes for people in forced displacement. And I myself haven't faced forced displacement. So just want to call that out because I think Hane's point was important. I also just want to clarify, Diana, some Julia probably would have been the sort of that philanthropy occupies the most amount to RLOs at the moment. I would highly recommend everyone look at the ODI report. So, but then within that, there's a both, I guess I'm proud, but also embarrassed that of that sort of 8.9 million that philanthropy gives direct to RLOs, 46% of that comes from Hilton. So proud of it, but also good God, if we're 46% of that, that doesn't feel nearly enough. In our portfolio, the Refugee Initiative, which is the newest initiative for Hilton Foundation, which also sort of gives us some leeway to do things differently, which we've been taking. 50% of our funding goes direct to local actors. That includes RLOs, direct to governments, direct to cities, direct to organizations, local organizations, not necessarily refugee-led. So just to say that's 50%. We made a commitment at the Global Refugee Forum, and overall the Hilton Foundation, one of the reasons I joined, is in line with the grand bargain of 25% commitment of all initiative dollars will go to locally led organizations, the sort of broad spectrum of that. And so we're trying to double click into RLOs, of course. I think the journey for this has been really interesting. I think it's been a journey both in terms of program officers like me, who are often white women or white men, sort of saying and having more and more, we're seeing foundations more and more hire at least folks with experience in implementing the programs they're overseeing. And so have been exposed quite a bit to how much better local organizations, refugee-led organizations do the work. And so that's been a nice shift. And Hilton is a huge sort of proponent of that. Most of our program officers, again, while being mostly white, have direct experience in at least programming in the spaces where they're working. I think Hilton recognizes what's cool is that having been on the other side at IRC for many years, our processes and application process are quite flexible and easy compared to our peers and bilaterals. And with that comes a great privilege of then being able to sort of be the first out the gate, given that to sort of fund organizations that aren't necessarily funded by donors like us. And so I think believing in this sort of trust-based philanthropy, I'm learning all these new philanthropy, trust-based strategic, whatever that means. So being in this trust-based philanthropy space allows us to sort of say, okay, we can then design processes and policies that allow us to move as a trust-based philanthropy with a strategic mindset, so we say. And I think what's been important is really recognizing both that we still have to operate within parameters. There are still things, and I want to remind everyone that the Hilton Foundation is a family foundation, and ultimately family is on the board, and the board makes the ultimate decisions of sort of the strategic overviews of each of the initiatives. And I think that's important to call out because it's not, to your point about gatekeepers, it's not just myself who's a gatekeeper for the Refugee Initiative, but the family and the board that is a gatekeeper. And so it's also about our role as program officers and using, and we've had some of our refugee leaders like Lou Blanc and Ana Maria Diaz and others come speak to our board, but also having the board have the board go on this gatekeeping journey, because ultimately that's sort of where the buck stops, in a different way than public funding, in a different way than corporate funding. And so I think that's just important to realize. And so I think what's important is really to sort of say, if we want to achieve outcomes for refugees, who best to know how to do that than refugee leaders themselves? And I think there's this constant back and forth, and that I hear a lot from my peers about risk, and about if one more person says, you know, how do you mitigate risk? It's like, well, how do you mitigate risk with IRC? How do you mitigate risk with Oxfam? Like, why is everyone held to a different standard? And so I think watching our language around that and being really real about what that looks like. But I'm looking at Diana because I speak too long often. But I think in just overall, I'm over time. As usual, I'll stop.
No, it's so great. You've actually moved sort of naturally into my second question for you. And it's around pathway 2, getting like really concrete about this pathway 2, around what are the specific characteristics of a funding package that we would consider equitable and high impact.
So I think, just to also point out and getting really practical. So if you ask, right, like if you ask the folks on this panel and they've said, what's the most high impact? It's multi-year. And often it's what we call in the philanthropy world, general operations, right? So it's not tagged to specific outcomes or specific things, which are dictated by the donor. Now, at Hilton, we are super dedicated to multi-year funding. We have not yet moved into the space of general operations. We still have a strategy, right? The refugee strategy, which I can pop into the chat because it also might answer some questions that I'm getting direct messages on, is only in 4 countries. It has to do with outcomes for children and has to do with outcomes for caregivers. That's within that we are flexible, but all grants have to achieve that. And so I think also thinking practically about what donors can and can't do at the moment, and then moving within that space is really important. Dan, is there any other specifics that I can address? Would it be helpful to also talk through, right, like what it looks like for a U.S. foundation to fund?
I'm going to move us along because we're a little bit behind time, but during Q&A, I know that there are questions coming in that dive deeper into how Hilton did this, because you are an exception to the rule right now. So I think many folks want to know, how do we help other donors get to where Hilton is? So
I'll just also call out Diana really quickly. I think it's just important, right? When I took this job 1.5 years ago, everyone's like, well, how have you moved the needle on this? How have you done it so fast? And I just don't get why it's so hard. Anyway, I just think we need to really start the conversation of the how and not the like what stands in the way. So
yeah, thanks for that. It goes to the importance of the mindset question, and maybe Hani's comment about, well, do people want to do this? Is there will?
100%.
Well, moving us, thank you so much, Barri, and thank you for sharing Hilton's journey and commitment, and moving us directly into pathway 3, which is on bottom-up accountability mechanisms, and wanting to bring us back to Hani. Hani, during our prep and during your introductory panel comments, you were really clear that in order to achieve high impact funding, in order to get to equitable practices, that there has to be this commitment to community involvement, community leadership, and that those things are what enable bottom-up accountability. And I know RLI has done some really interesting things around establishing community accountability mechanisms, and we would really love to learn from you what that looks like in practice. I also know you're hoping to bring in a lot of participation here, and you have some questions to pose to the group. When you are ready for me to pop those in the chat box, just let me know and I will do that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, accountability is always the big question, right? Like, how can we hold ourselves accountable? How can we hold each other accountable? How we can hold others accountable? And this comes from a place of care and of also like belief that things should go in an equitable, ethical way. I think before I start, I would ask the question directly to the RLO representatives here in the room with us, only for you. If you have the chance to hold donors, intermediaries, INGOs accountable, how would you do this? What would be the best kind of way or practice you could take to hold donors, intermediaries, and INGOs accountable? If you can maybe try to write few points in the chat. That would be really great. And Diana will help us putting the question on the chat as well. Let's take few moments to reflect on this question, only for RLOs for now.
Hani, my question, there's silence in the chat, and I'm curious what you make of that. What is your takeaway from it being hard to get some feedback on this?
I mean, I'm sure people would get a lot of thoughts or put in a lot of thoughts for this question. For me, it could take me some time because I'm not used to it as a refugee leader myself, and this is the reality. I mean, we don't know. Sometimes we don't know that we have the power and we have the right to hold donors accountable to their practices. Sometimes from our work, we see like the relationship comes with a lot of no questioning in a way. I cannot question donor. I cannot question people with power because I might struggle from the consequences. I might be punished. I might have cut off the funding. My RLO might maybe be excluded or blacklisted and so on. Some people are putting some ideas, sharing power, for example. Accountability would start with me and my team if we are able to implement what is promised to deliver on. I encourage you to put more, and maybe I would like to ask the same question to the donors in the room and the INGOs, the intermediaries in the room. How would you hold yourself accountable to the communities you support? Let's see how, if you have ways, practices, if you have mechanisms in place that you hold yourself accountable to the communities. Let's take a few minutes to reflect on this as well.
We have a lot of interesting feedback coming in. Hani, what is your take on some of these comments?
Yeah, I'm reading some very interesting comments. Like someone is saying that it's hard to hold donors accountable, and it's the reality how hard it is to question people with resources and power.
I see a couple comments around, somebody's talking about representation, and there's some accountability team. I see some people talking about the importance of INGOs holding one another accountable and what that looks like. What does it look like to create peer-based pressure rather than just bottom-up pressure to be enacting some of these ways of working?
Also, I see looking at the amount of funding distributed to RLOs and other local organizations is a way to hold donors accountable. Also looking at how to ease processes and the due diligence and application. Yeah, there are very different ways. I would say like looking into the some answers from refugee leaders, some answers from donors. Sometimes it looks like we are not on the same page of holding the donors, the people with power accountable to funding, to the power they have. And I think maybe I would like to invite for more dialogue and co-work together. Maybe donors you can call for some meetings with the organizations you work with and work around creating some sort of accountability mechanism, holding yourself accountable before holding the RLOs accountable. I just want to give maybe a few examples of how we do it at Really, and maybe it helps. At Really, before, like, the moment we started working in designing our intervention was to identify the problem as 6 refugee-led organizations, ask ourselves what is not working for us as refugee-led organizations, and from there we came up with the answers and the solutions for it that we envision it work best for us. And then we designed our modules of work participatory. We created our ways of working that is based on collective decision making. Our governance is the heart of what we do, how we manage this space, we manage it together. We have working groups with representatives of the 6 refugee-led organizations that made this coalition, and together we make decisions about every element of the movement we are trying to build. The second very important aspect of what we do is the involvement of our partners, grantees, in the process of deciding how things should go. For example, this year in our renewal process, our grantees reviewed and selected and decided who will get renewal for a second year. It was not only us, it was peer-to-peer review, peer-to-peer kind of scoring and decision making. And the next step, we are hopefully going to launch a more participatory grant making with new grantees, including them scoring for each other and deciding how we will distribute these resources. Also, one way of doing it is through sharing expertise and learning from each other. For example, in our strengthening capacity program, our grantees provide us with learning in which they sometimes they lead trainings themselves to peer organizations and also to the coalition members themselves. So it's not a top-down kind of process, it's more flat, participatory, and each one has a different role they fulfill.
Hani, thank you so much for illuminating some of the ways in which Really does this. And also the chat box has been picking up steam here with a lot of people offering different ideas on what community accountability can look like in practice. I encourage everybody to check these out and read them. I'm seeing, donor to donor pressure. There's definitely some work on mindset shifts. I see Maya has put in some information about their shifting power accelerator. So definitely look at some of these ideas. And Najeeba, we wanted to turn it to you to round out this panel. First, what would you build on around this conversation of community-based accountability, going back to to Barry's prompt to hear a little bit about how you're doing this? What would you add to community-based accountability pathway?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, Hani, and I can see in the chat box, some of the, most of the points have been mentioned, but one thing that I would say definitely is that when we talk about equitable funding practices, the real game changer is really about embracing bottom-up accountability. So what I mean by that is, firstly, it's about recognizing the importance of community engagement and leadership. It's not just about receiving funds. Most often, when we talk about funding or when we talk about refugee leadership and meaningful participation, most organizations that I have worked with tend to think that it's always about just receiving funds. No, it's not just about receiving funds. It's really about having a say in the way funds are being utilized. So how do we go beyond just providing funds and looking at the way that systems can be shifted? So again, I'm talking about participatory grants. Participatory grant making, in a sense, is a process that turns the traditional philanthropy on its head. So instead of decisions being made behind, closed doors, which most often happens, to be honest, it brings the community into the decision making. And that's what we want, on top of funding. So concretely, what does this look like? It means giving communities the power to shape the projects and initiatives. And I think Maya also talked about this. Hane talked about it. Barri mentioned it. So I think we've been talking about, how we could dismantle the power dynamic. And I've heard it also through the other series that Cohere has posted as well. So I think this notion keeps coming up. So how do we ensure, or how do we help communities to be given the power to shape their projects, to shape their initiatives that really impacts them? So it involves, again, actively seeking input, insights, and perspectives from those on the ground. So it's not just about a seat at the table. Most often we're advocating saying we want to sit at the table. No, it's not just about a seat at the table. It's about having a meaningful role in crafting solutions. That's what refugee-led organizations are actually asking about. So I would say, why is this important? Well, for one, it ensures that the initiatives that are funded are not just well-intentioned, but well-informed. That's the main thing. The community, after all, understands its challenges, and strengths better than anyone else. And I think COVID-19 was an excellent example of how the refugee community turned the crisis into an opportunity. So bottom-up accountability is really about fostering a sense of ownership over the philanthropic process. Most often when we talk about resource allocation, mobilizing resources, funding, and so on, we tend to get our head around the philanthropic processes, of forgetting the fact that we need to foster a sense of ownership. So that's, again, very important. So when communities have a stake in decision making, there is obviously a deeper commitment to the success and the sustainability of the project. And again, I would say, there are a lot of projects that RRLI has funded, and that's true example, as well as the Refugee Leadership Alliance. So in my experience, I've seen the transformative power of bottom-up accountability. It is not just a checkbox that in the funding process, it's a paradigm shift. And it really breaks down the traditional power dynamics. It promotes inclusivity, and most importantly, it leads to the initiatives, that genuinely reflects the needs and aspirations of the community. Barry mentioned something as Hane was speaking, and it reminds me of that example. And it really goes back to the question that Hane threw to the audience. How do we measure accountability? How do we, hold donors accountable, or organizations or stakeholders? Let me give you an example which APNOR has put together more recently. So APNOR has developed a self-assessment tool, an innovative self-assessment tool called Meaningful Refugee Participation Index Scorecard and its guideline. What we try to do through this self-assessment tool is really to promote and increase accountability in non-refugee-led organizations. It's a self-assessment tool that really measures, it's a measurement tool to reliably verify the inclusion of people seeking asylum, and I'm talking about forcibly displaced people, the stateless individuals. So the aim of the tool is to promote and verify meaningful participation of refugees in the decision-making processes, as well as program design, development, and implementation of initiatives supported either by donors or INGOs or governments and so on. So what we try to do through this innovative tool is increase accountability. What this scorecard does, it actually looks at different categories within the organization. For example, we look at, for example, like the board membership, for instance, like we look at the organizational development, we look at their vision and mission statement, we look at their institutional processes, whether they're explicitly refugee inclusive or not, we look at their staffing, their boarding, their allocation of financial and human resources. We also look at, 4 other categories like data collection and management. We look at the systems that evaluate impacts and provide services, for instance. We look at how they monitor compliance with standards of refugee participation practices. Does that even exist in the organization? We look at their budgetary transparency and so on. We look at something that we've spoken in this series workshop as well around diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Do they have enough refugees with lived experience as staff members in their organization? Do they have an understanding around meaningful refugee participation and equal partnership best practices? Do they have developed policies and so on. So the tools, in a nutshell, it's obviously it can take me an hour to talk about the tool and the guideline, but what we try to do by encouraging non-refugee stakeholders like donors, Hilton Foundation is in fact one of the organizations that we've tried to work with, and again, it's one of the proud donor organizations that, as mentioned by many RLOs, and including us as well, we are hoping to work with them as well, using the tools as a way to bring that self-assessment, that self-reflection in terms of how the institution is working, how the institution actually can go beyond just providing fundings and really changing the system internally within the donor organization. And similarly, we've been doing it with a lot of other INGOs as well. So it's another way of creating that accountability, bringing education and awareness around what really meaningful refugee participation means, what we actually mean when we talk about community involvement and leadership. What does it mean in practice? And through these developed tools, we are hoping to increase that learning and bringing that environment for where decision-making processes, for where program designs, for where implementation of initiatives can be improved and enhanced. So to sum it up, I would say bottom-up accountability, especially through participatory grants making practices, meaning giving communities a true voice. And we can see in the chat box too. So not just a token representation. And I'm sorry, sometimes the more we tend to talk about engagement of the community, the more we tend to talk about meaningful refugee participation, I think we also see a high level of exploitation going up as well. So it is really crucial for fostering genuine collaboration, understanding, and ultimately for creating a positive and sustainable change. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Najeeba, thanks. And we have just 3 minutes before we're going to open this up for Q&A. So please get your questions ready, pop them in the chat box. You can send them to me directly. But Najeeba, we're inviting you to round us out with our pathways 4 and 5. Perhaps you can speak to them in shorthand, because we have covered these. We've covered these in the entire other sessions, but when we were prepping for this, we felt like, gosh, we have to acknowledge the importance of representation as a key pathway for enabling equitable funding, and we have to acknowledge the importance of equitable partnerships as a way to enable equitable funding to RLOs. Could you speak to these final 2 pathways, and then we could open it up for Q&A?
Sure. Again, what I would say is that not only donors, again, I've been continuing saying donors, but I think in fact we're talking about the wider stakeholders, so the donors, the INGOs, the wider stakeholder really needs to step up to the plate by increasing community representation into their teams. I think that's super important. So again, this is not just about ticking a diversity box, it's really a game changer. And what does this look like in practice? I would say, again, it means having individuals from the communities we aim to serve right there at the decision-making table. So we're not talking about token representation. Again, we are talking about genuine and influential roles. These individuals, again, we know that they bring a wealth of insights, understandings, and lived experience that are quite invaluable in shaping effective, strategies, whether it is funding strategies or else. So it's really about, again, I think I'm re-emphasizing on the fact that we need to break away from the top-down approach. So having community representation ensures that our decisions, that your decisions, are rooted in a deep understanding of the challenges on the ground. So it's not just about making decisions for the community, but making decisions with the community. And the more and we've been, I think, collectively as refugee advocates, that's what we've been advocating for decades. So again, I would say, imagine a scenario where the team designing funding programs includes people who have a first-hand understanding of the needs, strength, and dynamics of the community. That's where the magic happens, and that's where we want to be. So it leads to a much more informed, targeted, and obviously impact of funding initiative. But you might ask, why is this not the norm already? And at least for people like Barri and Hilton Foundation, it's been easy, and I think that should be the case. But there could be a variety of reasons for many others. Sometimes, I think I would say it's a lack of awareness about the transformative power of community representation. And in other cases, it might be the resistance to change traditional power dynamics. It's not an easy shift, but it is a necessary, I would say again. So we need commitment. We need commitment from donors, we need commitment from INGOs to actively seek out and integrate community perspectives within, their institutions, their teams. It is not just a token gesture. It's really about creating a culture where community voices are not just heard, but integrated into the decision-making processes. And I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Najeeba. Okay, we're going to launch Q&A. I do see some hands raised in this big plenary. We're just going to do Q&A in the chat box, so please type your question there. When we go into breakout rooms, there'll be free-flowing discussion. The first question is for Maya that has been raised. And Maya, there's a question about what does it look like in terms of the role of the INGO? And I am excited to hear from you on this in terms of something you shared during our prep work about what does it mean to envision an entirely different system. What does the future role of an INGO look like at all? What is the frontier for 2050 or beyond?
Yeah, it's tough to ask these questions because it's very challenging to envision a future that sometimes feels so far away, if not impossible. So, but part of this work, the important part of this work is doing that. We need to think about the future in order to guide us towards that. So I think it's helpful for me to think about this in terms of different schools of thought, right? Different people approach this from different places, depending on their organizational context, how pessimistic or how optimistic they are. So I'd like to talk to you about 3 different schools of thought. One is that, this sort of aid work from international NGOs and donors, et cetera, led by them, it's critical. And that's the way the system works, and that we can reform it over time. So that's one school of thought, is that yes, it needs change, but we can reform it in small ways over time. Another opinion, another school of thought is that it is inherently colonial. We need to tear it all down, change the system. That's the only way it's going to work. We need to end it, exit it now. So there's many activists, many people that believe that's the way. It's not, it's not very realistic. So the systems exist as they do. So then the other school of thought is that, okay, it's complex. Yes, it's colonial. Yes, we need to reform. Let's hand over. Let's make a transition and do this and then exit. But the key part is the exit. In the end, if we truly do imagine a world in which communities have full agencies over their own lives, there's really no need for international NGOs and donors, foreign donors, to be supporting, unless it is at the request of those local communities. So that is how I see the role of international NGOs in the future, and donors, that communities, refugee communities and leaders are able to lead their responses in the way that they choose fit, and they ask for support when needed. So I hope that answers the question. I can go on and on on this topic.
Thank you so much. Barry, did you want to add anything to this question of the future of the INGO?
Always.
Space?
I come from 17 years in an INGO, and I believe, folks like IRC and others are doing great work in some form. I think the question is, right, I had an amazing role at IRC. A lot of it was spent fundraising and proactively going out for projects to get the most share of grants. That is the mindset, right? Like, you're paid to sort of make your business keep running. But yet the voice is, well, we're trying to run ourselves out of a business as an INGO. So there's a bit of a cognitive dissonance in that. What I'm seeing, which is great, is a lot of INGOs like IRC setting targets for amounts of subgrants in a particular project, all of that stuff. And not to say that Hilton hasn't funded INGOs and still won't in some capacity, but I worry this about INGOs, and I do worry this about intermediaries of, are we recreating the same systems and making ourselves feel better about it? So, okay, now I can give to IRC. They said 60% of their budget is going to go to refugee-led organizations within this project. And I, as a donor, feel good about that because in some ways, maybe it's slightly easier to give to an IRC because they're 501c3, and I know they have M&E systems already set up, so I don't have to pay for that. And then they'll give that money. But what comes with that money? About 3, 4, 5, 6 months of due diligence, another 3, 4, 5, 6 months of negotiating payments, often late ones, and then a dictation, which I was a part of saying to the RLO, sure, you can be our sub-grant, but you have to implement in these 3 ways. And so I think that's super problematic. And why are we creating this step so we all sort of feel better about ourselves of this, okay, well, if I can't give directly, I don't have time to take that 2 extra steps that might take, let me just give through an intermediary and like, that's fine. I just think we really have to question that versus taking the actual time now so that we don't set up this another humanitarian system, which sometimes I do feel like we should burn it all to the ground. And so I'm worried. I'm worried about the sort of language around it of intermediaries and INGOs mitigate risk. Again, this risk thing. Anyway, so that's where I'm at. It's a real struggle. And not to say, right, like, we're funding near. I also ask that people look at what the intermediary looks like, what their leadership looks like, how they distribute funds, those sort of things. But I worry.
Thanks, Barri. Najeeba, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a quick point. Most often when I go to these conversations and workshops and forums, we tend to talk so much about how refugee-led organization needs to be included and so on. And sometimes it creates that notion of thinking where we want to work on our own. And we want other stakeholders to actually cease or exclude it or disappear. I think that's not the case. What we're basically trying to say is that, how do we adopt a whole of society approach that really allows for each stakeholder to have an equal role? Whether you're a refugee-led organization, whether you're an INGO, whether you're a government, whether you're a donor, I think for everyone to work collaboratively, with various stakeholders is really the essential component for success and sustainability. So again, I think this question around INGO, I just wanted to bring that, important reminder that we need to be all in this together, and really promote that whole of society approach, in my view. And with that, what I mean is really, building strong partnership with local communities, looking at engagement with governments and NGOs, and how that could look at, sharing expertise and advocating for systemic change that addresses root causes, and looking at coordination with international agencies like UNHCR, like inclusive decision making, ensuring RLOs have a say. So it's really about, as I said, ensuring an equal role for everyone to be engaged. And I leave it there. Thanks.
Najeeba, that is reminding me of our 3rd session on equitable partnerships and how important that is in order to see there being better partnerships that are living up to the solidarity that you're making reference to. And I wanted to throw another question your way, Najeeba, in the chat box. Somebody is saying, well, if we imagine a world in which INGOs go away, or let's say their role is fundamentally changed, what would be needed for local communities and organizations to be taking on the work that would be no longer in the hands of the INGO? What does that look like for local communities and RLOs to be positioned to lead that work?
So if I'm understanding the question right, so for INGOs to leave and seize the refugee sector, is that what we're saying, or are we talking about funding landscape?
If their role is dissipated, right, and then there's a gap, there's something missing then, and the hope is that local communities and RLOs would then lead that work, would own and lead that work.
Sure.
What is missing for those groups to be there?
Yeah, I think it really goes back to my previous comment, which I made after Barri. I really think it works hands into hands. It's not. I don't think it's about excluding one and bringing the other. I personally really think that refugee-led organizations, the local communities, do have the power to bring immediate and sustainable change, as they are the first knowledge, first-hand experience people on the ground. And I've mentioned it throughout my conversation today. So I think they should be the one leading, but then we also require a supporting system around it. And the supporting system could be, how donors could come in, how INGOs could come in. And again, really, it goes back to it really goes back to how we look at facilitating knowledge sharing and capacity building, how we actually, share resources, whether they're financial, whether they're knowledge-based or in kind, how we collaborate, all of that to ensure that each stakeholder can contribute its unique strength to collective efforts. So for that, I don't know what the puzzle would look like, and I was mentioning about, RLOs being, one part of the pie, and INGOs could be the other. So if they're the missing part, again, I think that whole of society approach would become a puzzle. And so that's why for me, when I talk about engagement, coordination, and partnership and collaboration, I tend to see stakeholders and organizations working together, but it's important to note that the local-led organizations are actually the ones who are leading, initiatives, who are leading the solutions, who are crafting the solutions, because they are the ones who are actually going to be left behind as well. Like, sorry if I'm going to make my answer longer. Like, if you look at COVID-19, for instance, many INGOs had to withdraw a lot of field work because they had to come back home and they had no other option. So who was it that was supporting their own community? It was the local-led organization. They start creating radios. They start creating information flyers in their own languages about COVID responses. They started doing so many things while many other international organizations were forced to leave, a lot of operational fields. And I think that was a true testimony of why it's important that we need to believe and value in community-led leadership responses. And ensuring that there is collaboration and partnership with others as well. So I don't know how that would work. I hope my answer has been enough.
Can I add to you, Najeeba, really quickly? Because I think you are one of the kindest and most thoughtful human beings in thinking of this whole community approach. In all honesty, and straight up, it is a resource question. And I stand on this soapbox often. There's this deep catch-22, right? So the question about how would RLOs step into the space that INGOs play around global advocacy? I don't know, resources for them to attend global advocacy meetings, right? So if we think about the Global Refugee Forum, a lot of our RLO folks came to us and said, look, I want to send people. We don't have resources. Great. We can fix for that. So it's this constant catch-22 about RLOs. Oh, they don't have an auditing system in place. Oh, they don't have a CFO. Oh, they don't have, they don't have the right technical areas to do this particular work. Well, okay, then allocate the resources to do so. 45K is not enough to do the resources to do this when we're giving IRC. I worked on a $35 million grant, right? And so this catch-22 we have to constantly call out. Oh, RLOs don't have this in place. Yeah, because the funding is so restrictive. So,
absolutely. I think it's about dismantling power dynamic between organizations. Like, do INGOs wanting to give up their power? And power is resource. Absolutely, Barry. We couldn't agree more. And most often, that's why for me it's even difficult to think and even imagine for INGOs to disappear, because we will always face competitors. We will always have challenge of resource sharing, and we've seen it. And I think with the number of crises that are going on around our world, we tend to come across these issues on our way. Sorry, Diana, I think I'm taking so much of your time.
No, I hate that we have to cut the conversation off. I mean, there were so many great questions that we didn't even get a chance to answer. So thank you for your contributions. We are going to open breakout rooms, and the breakout room style is a little bit different if you've been a part of the other conversations. This is a continuation of a Q&A. Once the breakout rooms are opened, you can choose your own adventure, and each of the breakout rooms will have a name of one of our speakers. You can join whatever room of the speaker you want to hear more from. In those breakout rooms, once you're there, once you select where you're going, we encourage you to raise your hand and come off mute and ask your question verbally to your speaker. You can also ask your question in the chat box. If you want to hop around between rooms, if you feel like, oh, I've heard from this person, I would also like to hear from this person, you have the freedom to jump around as you see fit. And with that, we will call you back in about 15 minutes. Okay, everybody, welcome back. We are going to wrap up here in the last 5 minutes. First, I think in the chat box, an exit survey is about to be shown. Please take a minute if you can to fill that out for us. It helps us to ensure that we are building programming that is relevant to everybody. The second piece of information I wanted to share is that Forced Migration Review is currently seeking proposals on the theme of financing for displacement response. So our conversation today was very, very relevant. You can submit a proposal for that at the link that has just been put in the chat. And as our final wrap up, we want to give each of our speakers 1 minute to reflect on what came up for you in your breakout room and what is one thing you want to leave the room with. Maya, can I invite you to go first?
Sure. We had such a rich discussion in the breakout rooms, and I wish there was more time, but I just understand that there isn't. I think the final words I'd like to leave you with today is just a couple of reminders and requests. So for the donors and the INGOs and even the national NGO representatives that are in this virtual room, a reminder that displaced people are the experts of their unique situation, their own community, and their lived experience. So listen to them, follow their lead, trust them, fund them whenever possible with no strings attached, or in a way that is at least as flexible as possible. Keep pushing the boundaries, understand that the process will be uncomfortable. It will not be easy, but it will be worth it in the end. And it's a cliche, but it seems appropriate here that our vision for a better world starts at the end of our comfort zones. So, and for the refugee-led organizations, a similar piece of advice: don't stop learning, don't stop asking for what you deserve. The future is yours. And one day I truly believe we'll get there and we'll do it together. So please stay in touch. I hope you can share my LinkedIn profile. I would love to stay in touch with as many of you as possible. Thank you all for the work that you're doing. The fact that you've shown up here today speaks volumes to your commitment. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Hane?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I would say change needs a community, and through humanity we survived being in groups and communities. And I invite refugee leaders and refugees to be in community with each other, to be able to say no to those to things that they don't want to. And I think it's time to start a revolution, refugee-led revolution against the broken system. And we can do it together. Thank you.
Thank you, Hane. Najeeba?
Yeah, wow. It's always the most difficult thing for us as spoker, or someone who speaks a lot like me. So I would just say, let's remember that true change happens when we recognize again the strength within our refugee communities. So again, just like Maya and Hane and Barri have said, we need to listen and learn and co-create solutions together. So equitable partnership, at least, and meaningful refugee participation aren't just buzzwords. At least in our group, it was clearly indicated that they're the heartbeat of impactful, humanitarian efforts. So let's commit to amplifying these voices, building bridges, and working hand in hand. And with that, again, I would love to emphasize that it's super important to recognize and value the expertise of refugee leaders and the agency and the unique perspective that they bring. Equitable partnership should really be about ensuring that these initiatives are not only responsive to the immediate needs of the displaced community, but also contribute to the long-term resilience and self-efficiency. And let's not forget, when I say equitable partnership, I also talk about meaningful refugee participation. There's been a lot of instances when I talk about meaningful refugee participation, people tend to see that separate to equitable partnership. But again, I have to mention that that's not the case. It's really hands in hands. And I can see that my colleague Bakir, who's also on this call, he has shared a link to Asylum Access Equitable Partnership. I think position paper it is. It's an important paper to read. It talks a lot about how meaningful refugee participation is actually embedded and works and compromises the equitable partnership. And it is not just a moral imperative, it's the strategic approach that enriches programs, with cultural insights, local knowledge, and community-driven solution. So I highly encourage you to read that as well. Thank you very much for listening to all of us.
Thank you, Najeeba and Barri.
Okay, quickly, I liked Maya's framing. So to my fellow donors in the chat, in the room, wherever we are, do better. It's not that hard. To my intermediaries and INGOs, really think and reflect on, are you creating systems that are the same? What is your role? What does that look like? To my RLO crew, until we can burn down the system, please, when you approach donors, come prepared, read their strategy, try and work within their framework, and the donor sort of will be more flexible in that way. And then finally, Hane, I'm ready to pick up that protest sign and that revolution right behind you guys, especially in this group. I'll stand behind all 3 of you, all 4 of you in any way I can. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
What an incredible wrap up. Julia, over to you to mention what's happening next.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Please take 5 minutes to fill our exit survey. It's really important. I think you feel more informed and equipped to walk the talk within your organization. And so lastly, I want to reiterate that the next and last session of our interactive workshop series will focus on supporting localized refugee-led advocacy. So please stay tuned for this upcoming session and feel free to share this invite widely. Many thanks again, and we're looking forward to see you at the next session. Bye, everyone.